everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to Union Public Library. I don't think we could be luckier in any way than to have Carol Simon Levin come talk to us today about women's suffrage. I really thank her for coming. I really appreciate it. I want to thank the New Jersey Council on the Humanities also. And I want to thank all of you for being here. To keep in touch with our programs and everything else we're doing at the library, check our website, www.uplnj.org. Check our Facebook page and like us on Facebook, or send me your email and I will sign you up for our newsletter. So without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Carol. Carol.
Well, thank you so much. Let me share my screen. There we go. All right. Just to check in, everybody able to see my screen here?
Yes.
Splendid. Splendid. And can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay. All right. Splendid. So, as Deborah mentioned, my name is Carol Simon Levin, and it is my absolute delight to come via the internet to Union Public Library, or through Union Public Library, and the generous support of the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, to do my program that's called Reclaiming Our Voice. And I will be portraying Lillian Feickert, telling the story of the overlooked role of New Jersey in the fight for women's suffrage. So last year marked the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, which some people say gave women the right to vote. Today, what I want to tell you is that nobody gave women anything. It was a long, hard fight fought by 3 generations of women and some supportive men to gain that right to a voice in our country. And the other thing many people don't know is the role that New Jersey had in that fight. So let me introduce myself. My name is Lillian Feickert. I'm not quite a Jersey girl because I was born in Brooklyn in 1877. But at age 25, the ripe old age, I like to say, of 25, I married Edward Foster Feckert, who was a banker in New York City who soon became a banker in New Jersey. And we relocated from bustling Brooklyn to bucolic Plainfield, New Jersey. And I started making a home there and getting involved in church and community. And in 1910, I would be recruited by the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association President Clara Laddie to be the enrollment chair of that organization. And for the next 10 years, I would eat, drink, sleep, and dream women's suffrage. But of course, the fight for a women's role in this country does not begin with me. In fact, I like to think it goes back 101 years before that, when Abigail Adams wrote that famous letter to her husband, John, who was one of the delegates at the Continental Convention in Philadelphia, in which he urged them to, in the new code of laws, remember the ladies. Do not put such unlimited power into their husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. And then warned if particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. To which her husband responded that she was, and I quote, so saucy, and the new laws would not be particularly female friendly. With one notable exception, right here in New Jersey, in our Constitution, which was ratified July 2nd, 1776, we enfranchised all inhabitants of this colony of full age who were worth 50 pounds. By not explicitly stating white male, that Constitution implicitly enfranchised, gave the vote to some women, blacks, and aliens. Now, most women and African Americans were not eligible because of that nasty little property requirement there, because a woman who married all of her property belonged to her husband, and so she couldn't manage it. But after the Revolutionary War kills lots of people, lots of men, there left a lot of widows and women who never married. And so It's estimated about 5% of the landowners in New Jersey were there after the war. Well, initially, we see some newspapers celebrating the so-called petticoat electors. Now, one and all proclaim the fall of tyrants, open wide your throats, and welcome in the peaceful scene of government in petticoats, proclaimed the Sentinel of Freedom out of Newark in 1797. But in 1802, a so-called friend to the ladies who wrote in the Trenton New American stated, "Female reserve and delicacy are incompatible with the duties of a free elector. A female politician is subject to ridicule." Well, all of this is explained and brought out in a wonderful exhibit right now that's taking place at the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia, and there's a virtual exhibit as well that's called "When Women Lost the Vote." And the curators there uncovered 16 surviving poll records from elections during that time, and looking at them carefully have found just under 8% of the names are recognizably female, and they have found at least 4 black names as well. So women and African Americans actually did vote. But in 1807, there was an election for a courthouse in Essex County, and there was rampant fraud, and the losing side charged that men had dressed as women and then voted multiple times. But instead of prosecuting these election-stealing cross-dressers, the New Jersey legislature instead passed, all-male legislature, of course, a law to reinterpret the Constitution and eliminated or limited the vote to free white male citizens of 21 without a property requirement. And by this act, which is illegal, you can't amend a constitution with a simple law, but nobody fought it. By this act, women and black members of New Jersey were disenfranchised. Well, what ends up happening is women don't start speaking out for themselves. They start taking up the cause of abolition, anti-slavery. And one of these women is Lucretia Mott, who's living in Philadelphia and forms an interracial society there in the 1830s, the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. She and her husband meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her brand new husband, they're there on a honeymoon, at the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London. Now, Lucretia is a delegate. Elizabeth is accompanying her husband, who's a delegate. But both of them, as well as all the other women, are confined into a spectator's gallery. Delegate or not, they're not allowed to participate. And Elizabeth recalled walking home after the first day with Lucretia, resolving that they would hold a convention of their own for women's rights when they returned, as soon as they returned to the United States. Well, as soon as, turned out to take 8 years, primarily because Elizabeth was moving around and having babies. But finally in 1848, Lucretia visits her sister in way upstate New York, in the neighboring town, and is invited to a tea party. I like to call it the second tea party in American history, with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and 3 other Quaker women. And at that party, they exchange their displeasure with the rights of women at the time and decide they're going to do something about it. In fact, in less than 2 weeks, they will hold that long anticipated convention in the neighboring town of Seneca Falls. And it is mid-July, and the words of the Constitution, the words of the Declaration of Independence are still, in the air, and so they model their demands and their language on that document. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And they make a number of demands, including that women have control of their wages, of property brought into their marriage, of their children in the case of an abusive or drunken husband, all of which are basically unanimously endorsed by the people present, who were about over 300 people, about 260 female, but a goodly number of men as well. But one of the demands was very, very controversial. Elizabeth Cady Stanton insisted they needed the right to vote, which Lucretia Mott thought was too big an ask. She said, "Thee will make us ridiculous." But Frederick Douglass, who was the sole black person in attendance, supported Elizabeth. He said, without the vote, you have very little chance of getting any of your other demands. That led to a decade of women's rights conventions at which many women started to get their voice and their teeth into this issue. And they included two women who would be prominent in New Jersey, Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown. They had met each other in Oberlin, where both were studying Greek and Latin to discover whether the Bible said what the ministers claimed it said, which was that women had no right to a public voice. And they found in the original languages the Bible simply prohibited idle chatter in church, which is something rather different indeed. But in any event, Antoinette Brown would become the first female ordained minister in this country, and Lucy Stone would end up becoming a national speaker against slavery, for temperance, and women's rights. And Lucy would speak, she was one of the organizers, and would speak at the first National Women's Rights Convention that was held in Worcester, Massachusetts. Who's in the audience? Susan B. Anthony. She's another Quaker abolitionist. She's a school teacher, rather annoyed to discover she's making a quarter what the teacher in the next classroom is making, the male teacher. So she's pretty primed when she hears Lucy speak to start working for women's rights. And a year later, she will meet Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and it will become a partnership that lasts for half a century. Susan is single and therefore basically footloose and fancy-free. She can travel and speak. Elizabeth Cady Stanton eventually is having 7 children and is pretty well stuck at home for a good number of years. So, but her body may be confined, but her mind is not. She's frantically writing out the arguments for the women's rights movement, and Susan is taking them on the road. Or as Elizabeth's husband quipped, Susan stirred the puddings, Elizabeth stirred up Susan, and then Susan stirs up the world. Well, Lucy Stone ends up moving to New Jersey. She, in 1857, buys a house in Orange with the money she has earned from her lecture. She has married. After saying she wasn't going to marry, she does end up marrying Henry Blackwell, and but gets rid of obey in her vows and in their vows, and she keeps her maiden name. And Antoinette ends up marrying Henry's brother Samuel, and both of them, as I said, moved to New Jersey. As I said, Lucy buys this farm, and she's bought it with her own money, and in November the tax man comes, and she basically says, no way, there's no taxation without representation. I have no voice, I have no vote, I will not pay my taxes. And he replies that that's no problem, he's just confiscating the household goods to pay for them. Fortunately, neighbors who are also sympathetic to the cause buy these and return them to the family, but it is widely reported in reform circles. That same year, Harriet, let me just move this so I can see my reading. Harriet Fisher leads the residents of Monmouth County in petitioning the state legislature on behalf of women's rights and women's suffrage, and she's met with biblical misogyny. The New Jersey Assembly responds that revision of the state statutes would not only be a task in comparison of which the labors of Hercules sink into insignificance, but would be contrary to the subordinate position of women to men since Eve in the Garden of Eden. Well, all of this activism comes to a halt with the Civil War. Women put aside their own demands and step up to help out with the Union cause. They're sewing, they're filing, they're nursing, they're keeping homes, farms, and businesses going while their men are out a-warring, and they're expecting that these patriotic efforts will be rewarded after the war, but they will be bitterly disappointed. In 1866, at the 11th Women's Rights Convention, the abolitionists and the women's rights advocates joined forces to form the American Equal Rights Association with the goal of equal rights, particularly voting rights, for all American citizens, irrespective of race, color, or sex. And the following year, New Jersey holds our first statewide suffrage convention in Vineland with a special emphasis on women's suffrage. We will be the second state chapter to be established. and Lucy Stone gets elected its president. Vineland, incidentally, is a hotbed of progressivism and activism at the time. Susan Pecker Fowler, who is a teacher, blueberry farmer, and merchant, remains single all her life and does a similar tax protest. She writes annual letters to the newspaper for over 40 years, protesting having to pay taxes without voting rights. She also is a leading advocate of dress reform, which is very big among all of the women in the movement for a while at this time. And she and her friend Mary Tillotson will organize an anti-fashion convention in Vineland in 1874. Well, jumping back, in 1867, Lucy Stone, as the head of the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association, addresses the New Jersey legislature and urges them to submit an amendment to the Constitution to the people of New Jersey to strike out white and male. And it's a lengthy address with lots of arguments, including batting down the arguments of the opponents. It said women would vote as their menfolk do. Well, what's the problem? It said that women don't want to vote. Well, they don't have to. It said women would sometimes want to hold office. Well, Victoria across the pond is doing a very good job indeed. But nothing came of her pleas. She also published her arguments in pamphlets that went out across the state. The following 2 years, she, joined by Antoinette Brown Blackwell, petitioned the New Jersey legislature for voting and property rights, and they were thoroughly mocked. They were told women should not drag their shining skirts in the polluting mire of politics, and the men in the chamber laughed clamorously, it was reported. And one said, "No person is qualified to vote unless they are familiar with the appearance, sex, and size of that noble animal, the shad." So here you are, you now have a picture of it. I guess you have all you need to be a voter in New Jersey. Then some women in Vineland decided to take action, and on March 10th, 1868, Mrs. Portia Gage tried to vote. She was rejected. In September, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who just moved to New Jersey, they addressed an assembly on women's rights in Vineland. And in November, on November 3rd, 172 Vineland women, including 4 what were then called colored women, attempted to vote. They were not allowed to place their ballots in the official ballot box. They said, "No problem, we brought our own." And if you ever visit the Vineland Historical and Antiquarian Society, you will you can see that very ballot box. This was widely reported in Stanton and Anthony's new newspaper, The Revolution. But on the national stage, the 14th and 15th Amendments only enfranchised Black men. And Frederick Douglass, remember, he'd been a supporter of women's voting rights in 1848. He said there's no way that Congress is going to pass women's voting rights at this time, and we Black male citizens need it. He called it the Negro's Hour and pointed out that the history of Negro oppression, being hunted down, being hung from lampposts, children not being allowed to enter schools and so forth, necessitated the urgency of this moment. But Sojourner Truth, who had been throughout the 1850s very active on both the abolitionist and the suffrage circuit, she pointed out that Douglas's Negro's Hour excluded Black women. She said there's a great stir about colored men getting their rights, but not a word about the colored women theirs. And if they get the rights and we do not, we're just exchanging one master for another. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton fretted that because the word male was being introduced before the word citizen into the Constitution for the first time, it would take a century to get it out. She'd only be wrong by 50 years. But what happens is it splinters the movement into 2 branches. Lucy Stone, Antoinette, and some others, and their husbands and others, they form the American Woman Suffrage Association, and they decide to support the 14th and 15th Amendment and take their cause out to the states and territories and see if they can get some wins there before coming back to Washington, D.C. They have two very quick territorial successes. In 1869, Wyoming, territory which doesn't have to, a territory doesn't have to vote. The legislature and the governor can decide. They decide to let women vote. They have a 6-to-1 male-female ratio. They want to attract some wives. A few months later, Utah also does the same thing. Utah Territory, their motivation is different. The Mormons are trying to consolidate their power, and they practice polygamy, so they're going to bring a lot more voters into their column. But then, despite dozens of other campaigns, there are no long-term successes in that front. Meanwhile, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others decide to form the National Women's Suffrage Association, and they're going to fight to see if the amendment can be enhanced, enlarged to include women by fighting it right up to the Supreme Court. And so in 1872, a number of women across the country decide to try to vote. A group, interracial group in Washington, D.C., the Vineland voters. Sojourner Truth is in Detroit. Susan B. Anthony is arrested for trying to vote in Rochester, New York. She comes to her trial and attempts to testify, and the judge won't let her, saying she's incompetent to testify. This is a woman who does about 300 lectures a year. And he pulls out an already written decision fining her $100, which she refuses to pay. But for a variety of reasons, it's a different case that winds its way to the Supreme Court, which in 1875 rules that the Constitution, when it confers citizenship, does not necessarily confer the right of suffrage. So New Jersey, meanwhile, women and men in New Jersey who are backing suffrage, they are repeatedly trying to overturn or to restore the more universal definition of voting in this state. But in 1875, the revised constitutional amendment only enfranchises black males. In 1876, the National Women's Suffrage Association reads out a Declarations of Rights of the Women of the United States at the centennial of of our country, which was a big World's Fair that was held in Philadelphia. They're not allowed to read it out loud, so they have to just pass it out. And I like to say that the only woman who had any freedom at that fair was the arm of the Statue of Liberty. With no luck on that front, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and others introduce the 16th Amendment to the United States, which will get the nickname the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, to Congress in 1878, identical to the 15th except for the last word, race, is replaced by sex. It is thoroughly ignored by the members of Congress and will be reintroduced with very little effect for over 4 decades. In 1880, Elizabeth Cady Stanton does her own vote protest. She, accompanied by Susan B. Anthony, attempts to vote in Tenafly, citing New Jersey's original constitution, but of course she is rejected. It is, however, played up in the national press, and you may have seen some of these famous images. This one is from Harper's Weekly. Over this decade, from 1876 to 1886, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Gage they write the first 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage. But and they also organized a national petition to urge the political party conventions to support women's suffrage. But really, there's very, very little success anywhere. And with this lack of progress, women start losing interest in these one-issue organizations, and particularly because other organizations are springing up for women to throw their energies, one of which is the Women's Club movement, which gets started in 1869 in New York, and then in 1872, Orange, Women's Club of Orange is the first New Jersey, and soon there's several dozen across the state. And women get to meet, they discuss papers on issues, and this is a time when there's no higher education for women in New Jersey. So this forms a kind of informal adult education, which many women find thrilling. And it also forms an area, a mechanism for civic engagement. Women's clubs create public high schools, libraries, and other educational opportunities for girls. And they see suffrage as a way to amplify their voice. So they see suffrage as a tool for all of these other things. And that book, let me just go back for 1 second. I recommend highly the book No Stopping Us Now, about the adventures of older women in American history, which talks about this. Meanwhile, at the same time, religious women are finding their voice in the women's temperance movement. In 1876, Frances Willard becomes the head of this national movement. And it's huge and it's very powerful. If you can imagine that you are completely under the power of a man. In fact, a man can beat his wife as long as the stick is no thicker than his thumb. So a drunken man is a very dangerous man indeed. And a woman couldn't even bring her children out of that. He owned the children. So temperance became a really large motivating factor. And Frances Willard realized that the old techniques of prayer and education weren't going to be enough. They needed the ballot to enact the reforms they sought. And so she brings in the huge membership of this organization. She brings them behind the idea of women's suffrage. And there are a lot of Black chapters as well of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and they come in as well. They're segregated, but we're bringing that power. And so what happens is, instead of the idea of equality for women's rights, women's votes, it was a moral justification. If women vote, they will make society better with temperance, labor laws, conservation, consumer protection, and many more things. One of the interesting things that happens in New Jersey is that in 1884, the New Jersey chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union forms a suffrage committee. And 3 years later, and a great surprise, nobody knows, it was all behind closed doors, the New Jersey legislature unanimously passed school suffrage. Well, it was rural school suffrage, only for the school districts where the decisions were made in meeting, not by ballot. But they think it might have been a deal to appease the temperance activists and not rile the urban bosses. Nationally, however, there's very, very little happening on the suffrage front and all this competition. So the two suffrage societies decide to merge in 1890. It's engineered by the daughters of the original founders, and they become the National American Woman Suffrage Association, and new state chapters are linked to this. And we're re-energized in the state, particularly because we feel that with the stepping stone of school suffrage, full state suffrage won't be far behind. But then in 1894, New Jersey State Supreme Court declares the 1887 school suffrage law unconstitutional because women can't vote for people. They can vote for budgets, but not for people. Initially, it serves as a catalyst to just work on full suffrage and get it for everything. But pretty quickly, the women in the state realize, and the Women's Suffrage Association realize, there are not the votes for full suffrage. But they think school suffrage isn't that controversial. They can do a school suffrage amendment, and so they throw all of their energies behind that. To get an amendment through New Jersey is pretty arduous. It has to get through both chambers of the legislature twice and then go to the all-male electorate. But by 1897, they have gotten it through the legislature. It's going to the electorate. They figure, what is so controversial about school suffrage? There are children, there are schools. And they get endorsements from pretty much everybody. There's massive campaigning, and then there's a great deal of shock when it is defeated. And it is felt that probably it was urban bosses and who didn't want suburban women meddling or something, but it was a real letdown. Meanwhile, there has been a little bit of progress on the national front. 4 Western states have enacted women's suffrage. Wyoming comes into the Union as a state with its women. It refuses not to. Over the objections of Congress, it says, if you want us to be a state, you have to let us have our women. Yay, Wyoming. Colorado becomes the first state in which the all-male electorate open the doors to women's suffrage, and that's in 1893. Also, the first state a year later to elect women legislators. And then in 1896, Idaho and Utah, which no longer has polygamy, also managed to enact women's suffrage. But after that, it's the period that gets known as the Doldrums. Despite dozens of campaign and thousands of activists, there are no new victories. And in New Jersey, we're also in pretty quiet. We're pretty disillusioned. And the old guard all dies off. Lucy, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. One of Susan's last public statements was that failure was impossible, but it would require a new generation of leaders. And in New Jersey, we were blessed by two incredible dynamos who come on the scene in 1908. One is Mina Van Winkle, who becomes the head of the Equality League for Self-Supporting Women of New Jersey, which was a parallel organization to one that had been created in New York by the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Harriet Stanton Blatch. And that brought working women, both factory women and professional women, into a movement that previously had been dominated by middle and upper class homemakers. And Clara Schley Laddie was elected as president of the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association, and she was a dynamo. She re-energized the organization. She visited all the local chapters. She brought in labor support. And in 1910, as I mentioned many minutes ago, she named me as the enrollment chair. That year, 1910, we also saw the New Jersey Men's League for Equal Suffrage founded, which brought the power, both political power and monetary power, of men behind the movement, which was really quite essential. That year also saw the first East Coast Parade. It was organized in New York City by Harriet Stanton Blatch, and approximately 100 women from New Jersey participated. We were there. But you're thinking, a parade, what's so important about a parade? Well, a parade and public speaking parades, that was considered very unfeminine at the time, and quite shocking and quite daring to do. In fact, one of my friends, Florence Foster, later recalled, parading in the public streets, no lady, but we felt we must do it for the cause, and our problem was whether to tell our husbands before we marched or after. However, this new public face to the suffrage movement ended up losing us allies. Women's clubs started pulling back from supporting suffrage that year. The State Federation of Women's Club membership thought it was too controversial. They couldn't endorse it, and so they left it to individual women whether they wanted to or not. However, that year we also saw our first success in well over a decade. We won Washington in November by almost 2-1. And in the following year, after a huge campaign in California, the fourth attempt there, we won by only 3,500 out of 247,000 votes, an average of 1 vote per precinct. So it was a real nail biter, but we now had 6 suffrage states. And there was a sense of energy, of momentum, and a thought that we really needed to try again out east. And so in December of 1911, Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the militant suffrage leader from Britain, she came on a lecture tour and did a talk before 2,500 people in Newark, and we were energized. And the following month, we introduced a new suffrage resolution into the New Jersey Senate. The hearing was scheduled for March 13th, and on that day, there was a massive amount of...
No,
there's
fine. Sometimes I am.
Can we mute that person, please? Thank you. There was, so on March 13th, 1912, there's a great excitement. Approximately 600 women came to Trenton to witness the hearing before the Judiciary Committee. It was huge. The supporters spoke first. Mrs. Laddie talked about the social good that would come from women voting, and Miss Melinda Scott, who was a labor organizer, talked about how working women desperately needed the vote to improve their working conditions and for pure food laws, among other things. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, who you may be familiar with, she was the author of the Yellow Wallpaper. She came from California, which, as I just mentioned, had just won the vote, and pointed out that women needed votes just as much as men would if women had been making laws for men. But the antis were formidable. They included Mrs. Harriet Fisher, who was known as the Iron Woman because she owned an anvil factory. She'd inherited it when her husband died. And she also happened to be the first woman to drive an automobile around the world. So she was quite energetic in her own right. But she asserted that women were being deceived in the promises held out to them under the ballot, and told a reporter for the New York Times, a woman's place is in the home. And the resolution was defeated in both chambers. But trainloads of suffrage advocates would become a new form of advocacy in Trenton. It would become routine. But it also was a wake-up call, a rallying cry to the anti-movement. And the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage was formed that April, and there were soon chapters across the state. In November, that same November, Mary Philbrook, who was the legal counsel to the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association, had accompanied Harriet Carpenter, a teacher from Newark, to attempt to register to vote on election date. When she was refused, they made a formal legal challenge. So it was a kind of another route to trying to expand suffrage, to return suffrage to the rules of our original Constitution. But it ultimately failed in April. So by April 1912, we knew that in New Jersey, our only path to New Jersey women's suffrage would be through that referendum. That October, we held our first suffrage parade in New Jersey, in Newark. It was huge, nearly 1,000 people, lots of banners and signs, and the press were out in force. And among those who were in that procession was Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who at this point lived in Elizabeth. She was in her late 80s, and she was considered the oldest suffragist in the U.S. That November, I was elected president of the New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association. At the time of my election, there were 28 leagues with 1,200 members. In the next 8 years, we would grow our organization 100-fold. That year, however, we also had another election, and our Governor Woodrow Wilson was elected President of the United States. He was going to go to Washington at the beginning of March. And he was about to meet his nemesis, another Jersey girl, Alice Paul, who was a Quaker from Moorestown, who'd gone to England to study social work and come back in an education in activist suffragism. And she said, unless we publicize this federal amendment, unless we work hard for this federal amendment, we will not get it. Unless women are prepared to fight politically, they must be content to be ignored politically. And so she and her friend Lucy Byrne plan a huge parade down Pennsylvania Avenue on the eve, the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. As she's making these plans, we're busy in Trenton again making plans for a second attempt at our referendum. And the publicity includes General Rosalie Jones and her suffrage army. Here they are. The No Spring Chickens, they're a bunch of women who resolved they are going to walk from New York to Washington, D.C. for Alice Paul's parade. Actually, they end up walking from Newark. They come across the river and then start there. And you can see them there and walking right through Newark. And then they stopped in Trenton, where they delivered a suffrage message to the governor and the legislature. And they were joined there by, at this point, 2,000 activists. Woodrow Wilson does his best to dodge us, but this time the measure passes in the Senate, and it passes because we've been able to convince the New Jersey senators that they're not voting for suffrage. They're simply voting to allow the all-male electorate of New Jersey to decide whether women should be allowed to join them. Then it's off to Washington, D.C. on March 3rd. We join delegations from across the country. 5 to 8,000 women is estimated. We were led by New York City labor lawyer Inez Mulholland, and as a well-organized parade, we set off down Pennsylvania Avenue proclaiming, "Give women the vote." But it soon turned to chaos. It's estimated 500,000 unruly spectators were there, and they broke through the lines and they tore at women's banners and their clothes and their hair, and they shoved and yelled abuse and poked cigars at us, and police did absolutely nothing to stop them. Ambulances had to push through the crowds to reach the marchers. But the result was that the suffrage amendment gained national headlines, which thrilled Alice Paul. And we were pretty thrilled here in New Jersey because we'd also that very same week had success in the legislature. So that summer in New Jersey, we did a lot of campaigning. We knew, as you remember, we needed to pass the legislature a second time before sending it to the voters. And so we had 3 women who went all around the state in a suffrage caravan wagon, eat, drinking, and sleeping, and pushing the suffrage idea. We had meetings of the New Jersey Men. We were reaching out to clergy and other influential people. But then in August, we discovered that the government had failed to publish the text of the amendment, the resolution, in the newspapers, as was required by law. And we rushed to Trenton to discover that they said, the governor's office said, "Oh, sorry, we completely forgot. It was an oversight." Oversight my foot. We were very furious about this, but there was absolutely nothing we could do. We were going to have to start over from square one in the 1914 legislative session. But immediately after our meeting that year, we headed down to Washington, D.C. to help Alice Paul with another initiative. She wanted women from New Jersey to meet with President Wilson as his, ex-members of his state, to urge him to work toward the federal amendment. And so over 70 of us did go down there, but he basically barely met with us and didn't give us much of an answer. Then it was back to Trenton, January 28th, 1914, and we brought the New Jersey suffrage referendum up yet again. This time it easily passed both houses. And then we discovered that the Senate had failed to publish the text in their journal as was required by law. Probably another dirty trick, but this time we were no longer so naive and we caught it in time. But our opponents were also getting stronger. There were now 2 organizations, the New Jersey Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage, which was primarily female and had almost 15,000 members, and the Men's Anti-Suffrage League, which was much smaller, but very, very powerful. And I remarked, we haven't 1/10 enough active workers to carry on the present work as it should be carried on, and not 1/5 enough money. The antis are very strong here and are fighting us tooth and nail. At our convention in November, however, we were pretty excited because it was pretty obvious it was going to pass very easily through the legislature. So we turned our attention into how we were going to get the electorate behind us. And we hired 4 organizers and planned aggressive campaigning across the state. And the Referenda Bill was the first bill in the 1915 session. It was easily passed, and a special election date was set for October 19th. So now we had to concentrate on persuasion. We New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts had also passed referenda, so all 4 states were going to go to the voters. And our campaign slogan was "Victory" in 1915. We had high hopes. We had lots of publicity and propaganda, over 1.5 million pieces of campaign literature, and over 500,000 of other kinds of propaganda. We had parades, lectures, performances, automobile processions, ball games, anything to capture the attention and hopefully the sympathy of male voters. We had a Cape Crusader dog. We had a suffrage boat. We had a suffrage torch that was passed from New York across the Hudson to New Jersey, and we even had a suffrage camel. We had lots of posters going up pointing out the social good from women's votes. And the efforts of African American women were particularly strong at a time when the white women's clubs were refusing to throw their weight behind women's suffrage in 1915. The black women's clubs did come to our aid, and Reverend Florence Spearing Randolph had organized 30 of these into a real powerhouse across the state. But the antis were extremely powerful, and there was a lot of money from the liquor interests who were afraid of prohibition, from manufacturing, who were afraid that women would enact stronger labor laws, less child labor, and so forth. Political parties who felt that women were far less corruptible than men, and even well-off women who thought that it was unladylike to want the vote. The state was flooded with flyers that claimed socialism and feminism would help to lay the axe at the taproot of Christian civilization. And the political bosses teamed up with the liquor industries, and saloons handed out tickets that were good for 2 drinks if women's suffrage was defeated. We were jubilant when President Wilson finally, 2 weeks before the election, came out in support, but journalists were pretty cynical, pointing out that women in 11 states in the West already had the vote, and he was worried about his own election the following year, and so he couldn't oppose suffrage, but he did say that he was supporting only state by state, not federal suffrage. Newspaper coverage was limited. The war was raging in Europe, and we really didn't know what was going to happen, and were crushed when it was defeated quite substantially. And this was a sign of things to come. Only rural Ocean County passed it, and 3 weeks later, the other 3 states, New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, it also failed there. And we knew in New Jersey we would have to wait 5 more years to try again. That was the rules of such things. But New York only had to wait 2 years, and Carrie Chapman Catt, the new president of the National Woman Suffrage Association, National American Woman Suffrage Association, vowed that they would indeed fight again then. But Alice Paul said, these 4 defeats are a sign that we are never going to win this race by doing it on a state-by-state basis. We have to throw all our energies on a federal amendment. And she starts a petition campaign, gathering petitions across the state from California to New Jersey, and then delivering them to Washington, D.C. There's also a new branch of her organization, which is initially called the Congressional Union, opening in Newark. And Allison Turnbull Hopkins and Julia Hurlburt take charge of this, and they start going all across the state and to Washington to work for the federal amendment. Meanwhile, Alice Paul, who's impatient with the Democratic Party, which is President Wilson, and also in control of Congress, for not supporting the suffrage amendment, says we're going to borrow a technique from England and work to defeat all Democrats. She forms the National Women's Party and attempts to do that. Now, that is a real problem for us in the New Jersey and National American Women's Suffrage Association, because we have friends and foes on both sides of the aisle. So we come up with a different solution. Carrie Chapman Catt in the convention in August of 1916 takes place in Atlantic City, she comes up with the winning plan, which says we have to continue to pursue both state and federal approaches, and especially just get as many pro-suffrage legislators on a state and national basis as possible. Despite Alice Paul's campaign, President Wilson is reelected. He campaigns on, he kept us out of war, and even many women vote because they don't want to go. So after he is reelected, Alice Paul comes up with a new strategy, a novel strategy. She initiates National Women's Party picketing of the White House. It's the first time anybody has ever picketed the White House. And she asks women from across the country to volunteer to be silent sentinels. You see Alice Turnbull Hopkins, she is volunteering right there, holding that sign, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Initially, some of these women are admired. They are standing out in all weathers, in freezing conditions. Some people are bringing them warm bricks to stand on or hot cocoa, but a lot of people think this is not something women should be doing, and that becomes an even stronger sentiment after we go to war on April 6th. Many people think they should stop, including Harriet Stanton Blatch, who'd come up with the idea of these pickets, but she says at wartime we can't do it. But Alice Paul says in wartime we must. That President Wilson had said the reason we were going to war was to protect democracy, but he was denying it to half his citizens at home. But the mood gets very, very ugly very fast. The U.S. Committee on Public Information is whipping up patriotism, and the Espionage and Sedition Acts are passed, which will make speaking out against the war illegal, punishable by fines or imprisonment. On July 14th, Bastille Day, the leaders of the New Jersey National Women's Party, Julia Hurlburt and Allison Trumbull Hopkins, are among those picketing for liberté, égalité, and fraternité when they are arrested, and they are eventually sentenced to 60 days in the Occoquan workhouse. They end up being pardoned after 3 days by the president, probably because Allison's husband is his New Jersey campaign manager. But this is the start of a lot of arrests. The banner on the rhetoric on their banners is escalating. They're calling him Kaiser Wilson. They're telling the Russian delegates they're being deceived, and the anger of the crowds becomes palpable. Half a dozen women are picketing silently, but 500 people are attacking them. But it's not the attackers who are arrested, it's the silent picketers, and they're charged with obstructing sidewalk traffic, thrown in brutal prison conditions. And after they appeal to be treated as political prisoners, instead they're beaten, they're placed in solitary confinement, they are forcibly fed, they're not allowed visitors or messages. There's a night of terror on November 15, 1917, where Lucy Burns is actually strung all night long by her wrists from the cell door, loses all feeling, of course, in her hands. But this does get out to the newspapers and does engender sympathy to the protesters, and the administration ends up pardoning them and capitulating them right after Thanksgiving. It can't afford a death in prison, and the nightmare, the public relations nightmare that would be. And if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend the film Iron-Jawed Angels. In any event, in March 1918, the court will overturn those convictions and say you have a right to picket as long as it is lawful, which is why you can do that today. Meanwhile, the National American Woman Suffrage Association is working on bringing a few more states into the fold, particularly the huge New York state. And they're using war imagery, pointing out all of the things that women are now doing for their country, and the only thing they're asking for return is the vote. There's a huge parade in New York City pointing out women's work for the war, Liberty Bonds, Wilson's endorsement of state drives, and this time they are successful, and New York's 45 electoral votes are now in the suffrage column. And 6 other states, primarily in the Midwest, have managed to get presidential suffrage as well. We tried that, but didn't have any success here. But women now have political power. In the 1918 elections, they will represent one quarter of the women in the country will be voting even more in 1920. And finally, the women's clubs of New Jersey have come back on board. 2 years after their partners nationally, they do finally join back to support suffrage, and they elect a staunch suffragist as their president. And so, whether it's the political math, the sympathy for the prisoners, or whatever, for the first time in 40 years, the suffrage amendment will be coming up for consideration in both houses of Congress in January 1918. And on January 10th, on the 40th anniversary of its first introduction, long before dawn, women are waiting to watch in the gallery as the suffrage amendment is reintroduced. They're not, incidentally, they're not allowed to keep their knitting. Maybe somebody's worried about the sharp knitting needles. I don't know what, but a huge bag, a huge pile of the bags is outside the door. But President Wilson does address the House and urges them to support women's suffrage as fairness because of the work women have been doing for the war, the sacrifices and the work they've been making. There's massive lobbying by both our organizations, and it passes with exactly the 2/3 needed in the House. There's great cheering, but we're immediately back to work because we know we still have an uphill battle in the Senate. Made even more difficult because during the year 10 senators die, including 7 supporters, and one of those is New Jersey Senator Hughes. We're doing telegrams, editorials, lobbying. This is the year, though, of Spanish flu. And finally, when the vote is taken on September 30th, it is defeated by 2 votes in the Senate. We are working very hard in New Jersey to try to elect a replacement for Senator Hughes to send down the temporary replacement for his remaining term, but we are unsuccessful. And they do one more vote in the lame duck session, February 10th, 1919, and the amendment loses in the Senate by 1 vote. So had we been successful, we would have had it through both chambers in that Congress. However, we have to wait till the next Congress reconvenes, which happens May 19th, 1919. It easily wins the House this time because we've got a lot more pro-suffrage votes thanks to the election there. But the Senate is doing everything it can to delay it. We may see that today. It may be a familiar tactic because they want to keep it as long as possible so that it makes it harder for the states legislatures to enact it before the 1920 election. There's lots and lots of lobbying, and finally on June 4th, it does pass the Senate. But we still have to get 36 state legislatures, 3/4 of the then 48 states. And many governors are reluctant to call special sessions. Our neighbors in that 1915 referenda burst, all 3 of them quickly ratified the amendment that summer. But New Jersey's a challenge. We don't think we have the votes. So we have an extensive campaign that fall to try to elect pro-suffrage candidates. And we particularly and interestingly back Edward Edwards, the Democratic candidate for governor, because the Republican candidate has not endorsed women's suffrage. And we are successful. He wins. In January of 1920, the new legislature is called to order, and they begin formal consideration of the 19th Amendment. It easily passes the New Jersey Senate on February 2nd. But the House is something different entirely, the Assembly. The antis are out in force. They're trying to convince them to vote against it. One writes a letter from a real man to a politician calling women's suffrage the greatest menace now threatening the stability of American government. There's a late night session on February 9th that crawls right into the early morning hours of February 10th. But finally, when the vote is called, it passes. Basically, a group of Essex County legislators vote en masse for suffrage. And we get them into the column, and we become the 29th state to endorse the amendment. The antis don't give up. They urge the governor to veto, but he points out that A, he can't, that's not part of his role, and B, it is his pleasure to approve the resolution, and he is sending the official copy to Washington. And you can see Senator Frelinghuysen congratulating Betty Graham on our ratification. That April, a grand victory convention is held in Newark, and we turn our New Jersey Woman Suffrage Association into the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. And I am named treasurer of that organization. But the fight's not yet finished. We haven't won. And one by one, some of our hopes are knocked down. Delaware, Connecticut, and Vermont refuse to endorse the amendment. And most of the South is out of the question. Racism is coloring that decision. It looks like Tennessee is our only hope for success. And so in August of 1920, massive numbers of supporters and opponents of women's suffrage descend on Nashville. The Senate, the Tennessee Senate easily ratifies it again, but in the House, it looks like it's going to be a tie that will defeat it. Basically, the antis were wearing red flowers, the pros were wearing yellow, and it looked down at the floor like it would be even. And then Harry Byrne, who was wearing a red flower, changes his vote and votes aye. And it turns out he'd received a note from his mother that very morning, which said, "Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification. Vote for suffrage and don't keep them in doubt." He voted yes. Women screamed, yelled. We have finally had it. August 18th, ratification passed. Well, the aunties still worked on it for over a week trying to overturn that decision, but they were unsuccessful, and on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment was officially adopted in Washington, D.C. It had been 144 years since Abigail Adams, 72 years since Seneca Falls, hundreds and hundreds of campaigns. We finally had the right to vote, a voice in America's government. And you can see every part of this that was gray did not have the vote before that election. But I like to say some women because Native Americans weren't citizens, most of them, and couldn't vote until 1924, the Snyder Act. And Utah and New Mexico kept most of them from voting until 1962. Chinese Americans were denied suffrage by the Asian Exclusion Act till 1943, Japanese Americans till 1952, and many states used poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence to effectively prevent their African American citizens from voting until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was strictly limited by the Supreme Court in 2013 and is in danger now, even more so by the current court. If you're ever on Jeopardy and asked who was the last state to ratify, it was Mississippi. They didn't do so until 1984. Only one woman, pioneer suffragist, lived long enough to cast her ballot, and that was Antoinette Brown Blackwell, a great-grandmother in Elizabeth, who very excitedly cast her vote in the 1920 elections. As for me, I soon left the League of Women Voters because I decided I could be more effective in partisan politics and became very active in the Republican Party. I saw that women helped ensure that equal numbers of men and women would be on all committees, and women would be on all juries and on various state boards of education and health. And that women wouldn't have to work the night shift. But I soon got disillusioned by the party's dishonesty and its support of repealing prohibition. I was strictly a temperance supporter myself, and I was ousted in 1925 by the party leaders. The same year my husband filed for divorce. He'd been pretty supportive of my suffrage activities, but now he said that I was too often away from the home. Now, he married his secretary 6 weeks later, so probably that was the real reason. 3 years later, I ran in New Jersey's Republican primary as a dry pro-prohibition candidate for senator, but I was defeated, and I left politics at that point and devoted myself to home and gardens and traveling and so forth until my death in 1945. But women keep pursuing politics. We have had a long haul. As of 2019, there were 358 women in Congress versus nearly 12,000 men. Our current Congress in 2021 finally broke through the 25% barrier, and we finally have a woman in the executive branch. Kamala Harris is our vice president. Why is that such a big deal? Well, until the red box, she was probably would have been enslaved. Until the blue box, she couldn't vote. Until the yellow box, she might likely have attended a segregated school. And until the green box, she couldn't have her own bank account. It's the courage and persistence of so many women who've made that difference. We have the most diverse Congress in our history, but we do have a long way to go. These are actual September 2016 issues. Look at the messages we give our girls and our boys. Carrie Chapman Catt pointed out that the vote is the emblem of our equality, the guarantee of our liberty. It's been costly. Prize it, use it intelligently, conscientiously, prayerfully. Progress is calling you to make no pause, act. To which I say, vote, organize, volunteer, run for office. And if you want more information on the women's vote in New Jersey, I have a parallel article to this presentation called Reclaiming Our Voice that was published in Garden State Legacy, which was accompanied by articles about the role of people of color in the movement in New Jersey and of the aunties in New Jersey, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton's attempt to vote in Tenafly, New Jersey's suffrage torch, and those petticoat electors, and some wonderful poems created by Susanna Rich for suffrage. And you can find a link to that issue if you go to my website, tellingherstories.com, which is also where you will find a link to my book, which I've made the ebook available for free with a suggestion that you support women's rights or voting rights organization if you feel so inclined. And there are links to my other programs on women's rights and women's suffrage, as well as my other programs on other topics. I have 2 on early women aviators, 1 on Emily Roebling's role in the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge, and 1 on Crazy Daisy, the indomitable Juliet Gordon Low, founder of the Girl Scouts. So I'll finish with this wonderful quote by Alice Duer Miller, who did quips about women's suffrage during the 1910s. She wrote, what is a legislature? A representative body elected by the people of the state. Are women people? No, my son. Criminals, lunatics, and women are not people. Mother, what is a feminist? A feminist, my daughter, is any woman now who cares to think about her own affairs, as men don't think she ought to. And just one last thing, this is a wonderful map that shows where women around the world, when women around the world got the vote. And most of them got, well, you can see, one curious anomaly is that right in the middle of Europe, in Switzerland, they did not get their vote until 1975. And there's a marvelous film called The Divine Order, which shows women, including women in bell bottoms, 1960s miniskirts and bell bottoms, working for the vote, which is really fun. I highly recommend it. And speaking of films, in the early 1970s, you may have, some of you are old enough to remember going and watching Saturday morning TV, and they had Schoolhouse Rock. And on the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, they created this Schoolhouse Rock, Sufferin' Till Suffrage.
Now you have heard of women's rights and how we try to reach new heights. If we're all created equal, that's us too. Yeah, but you will probably not recall that it's not been too long at all since we even had the right to cast a vote. Well, sure, some men bow down and call dismissal. Yeah. Let us hang the watch out and wash the dishes. But when the time rolled around to elect a president, what did they say, sister? What did they say? They said, see you later, alligator. And don't forget my mashed potatoes, cause I'm going downtown to cast my vote for president. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. And the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. And now we pull down on the lever, cast our ballot, and we endeavor to improve our country, state, county, town, and school. Those pilgrim women who braved the vote, they could cook the turkey, but they could not vote. Even Betsy Ross, who sewed the flag, was left behind that first election day. Then Susan B., Anthony, and Julia Howe, Lucretia Mott, they showed us how. They carried signs and marched in lines until at long last the law was passed. Oh, we were suffering until suffering. Not a woman here could vote no matter what age. Then the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. Yes, the 19th Amendment struck down that restrictive rule. All right, we got it now. Since 1920, sisters unite.
So again, thank you so much for having me here today. And I will stop sharing my screen and get a chance to talk with all of you.
We do have a question, but I just want to thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities through the New Jersey Women's Vote, the 19th Amendment and 100 Initiative again. So thank you to them. And we do have a question from Phyllis. I don't know if you want to ask it yourself or you would like me to ask it.
Sure, I can ask it myself. I just wondered if you had any update on the Equal Rights Amendment, and is there any activity on it at all?
There is right now. In fact, I just received an email this week. As you probably know, it was up to 35 and then the time ran out. And a couple of years ago, Illinois became 36, Nevada became 37, and then at the beginning of this, sometime in 2020, I think it was, Virginia became 38, the last one needed. But the archivist has, two things have to happen. The archivist has to certify that vote, and apparently he hasn't, the National Archives. So I received this week a note asking us to contact the archivist and urge him to certify that 38th state. And the second thing is that because the amendment was passed through Congress with the time limit, that time limit needs to be extended. And so they have done a bill to do that through the House. Guess where it's done? So unless there's absolutely no support from the Republican Party on this one, interestingly enough, it was overwhelmingly and bipartisanly supported, when the Equal Rights Amendment was first passed. But that was before the moral majority. That was before, it was a different time when we had a lot more bipartisan legislation. And right now there is not a single member on the GOP side of the aisle supporting it or almost anything else. And because of the filibuster, they need 60 votes to pass any legislation unless they decide to get rid of the filibuster, as many people are now saying it should happen. But Manchin from West Virginia has said he doesn't want to do that, and without all 50 votes plus Kamala Harris, off his 50 Democratic votes plus Kamala Harris, they cannot get rid of the filibuster, and therefore the Republicans are able to stymie any piece of legislation they want to, except for the budget resolution reconciliation, which is what the COVID rescue plan is being is how that's being run in. And so instead, they can't stop it. What they are doing instead is that they're trying to slow it down. One of the things is that one of the Republicans has now insisted that the entire 700-page bill be read out loud into the record, which is going to take at least 10 days. And then they're going to be throwing one after another amendments on this bill. Basically, it looks like the bill has the votes to pass without any Republican support, which looks to be the way it's going to happen, because no Republican has come after the bill, even though 55% of Republican voters support the provisions, the $1,400 support, the extended unemployment, many of these things. Not a single Republican has supported this bill. So what they're doing, though, is by having no Republican support, they have to have every Democrat in support, and there's just a lot of several moderate Democrats who are trying to have some things stripped out of the bill.
So Carol, I'm going to stop you right now because we're way over time.
Okay.
We do have another question. I apologize for interrupting.
Not at all.
But before we get to that, can you describe that? I can do it, but I think you can do it better. On March 31st, we're going to have a program with Susanna, and I was hoping you could talk about that since you know it so well.
Certainly. Yeah, I was in a poetry slam today, and I don't write poetry, but I can and do enjoy reading it. And I actually brought poems from Susanna's collection, uh, and read one of them in that poetry slam. Her collection is called Shout, Poetry for Suffrage, and it is first person poetry. So if you say, oh, poetry is boring, it is not boring. Remember how I told you about Lucy Burns hanging from her wrists all night long in that jail cell? Well, that poem talks about hanging from the wrists. I think it.
And she's coming to our library on March 31st, which is, and she was an Emmy nominee. She's a singer-songwriter. So it's good. It's going to be great. And I hope everybody signs up for it. And Nancy, I'm going to get to you right after.
And so basically, yeah, it's like a one-woman show. It's so personal, and you are there with my hang all night, shut up, my fingers, my hands, my arms pierced as if by infinite needles. You're there. It is so powerful. I can't say highly enough about it.
Thank you, Carol. I want to get Annie's question in. Annie, did you want to ask it yourself, or would you like me to ask it? Annie? So I'm going to ask it. I think she's having mic problems. This is for you.
Here it says, what drew you to tell women's stories? I have always been attracted to women's stories. I, in college, in the 1970s, at Cornell, they actually had a women's studies program. It was a minor, but I did it as a minor. History of women, history of women and history of technology. And then what got me into doing what I'm doing now is a funny story, in that I was at Curve's gym, and I'm talking to the person on the next piece of equipment, who turned out to be a professor at Stevens Institute, who was teaching K-12 teachers how to incorporate science and technology into their curriculums. And she said, and I just found this fascinating woman. Her name's Emily Roebling, and I think she'd be a great role model. Have you ever heard of her? And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I have. I had been up in the Hudson Valley a few months before and stayed at a bed and breakfast called the Bird and Bottle Inn that is said to be haunted by Emily Roebling. So for those of you who don't know who Emily Roebling is, she is the woman who helped bring the Brooklyn Bridge to fruition. So she wanted to write a book. She wanted to find a book on her. At the time, I was a children's librarian. I said, oh, I would be absolutely delighted to look for one. Found there wasn't one. Remembered my college interests, decided to write one. Long story short, mine never got published, but there are two wonderful children's books out there now. But I started talking about her, and people started saying, hey, could you come and talk about her? And I said, well, I can talk about her or as her. And they said, oh, come as her. And that is how I started doing this 8 years ago. And every year,
and we're glad you did.
I just kept figuring out new people and to be in, stories to tell.
Thank you. We are very glad that you did and appreciate it. And Nancy Kennedy has a book that she wants to talk about.
Sure.
Hi, Carol. Carol, I just want to say thank you. You did such a prodigious amount of research.
Well, thank you.
I was familiar with a lot of what you said, because last year I had a book release for children about the suffrage fight from Norton Young Readers. It's called Women Win the Vote, 19 for the 19th Amendment.
Can you push it a little bit forward, because it's too shiny.
Yeah.
There you go. Little back. There.
There?
Perfect.
It's called Women Win the Vote, 19 for the 19th Amendment. It's for middle grade readers, and I take 19 of the women that you were talking about and profile them. I was really interested. I didn't see anything about the suffragists as children, where they were born, what their family was like, what led them to the suffrage fight. So that's where I found my niche. And I do find that I have just as many adult readers as children, because none of us learn.
I am a big fan of children's books for learning anything about it. Whenever I do any research, I often start there, because in order to write a children's book, you have to find the essentials, the hooks, what motivated them, and it doesn't get buried under 400 pages of prose.
Yeah.
So I always start, and your book's fabulous. I just read a book by Veronica Chambers and the staff at the New York Times, which is another great book finish the fight. In fact, I was doing that because I was doing research for my most recent program, which is called Overlooked No More, where I really bring out, unfortunately, there are so many women of color in the movement, but in my regular 1-hour programs, it's hard to include them in the through line. You have to throw so many people on the cutting room floor. So I wanted to give them an entire program of their own where I could get deeper into that and kind of, and so that's what I've done. And
I know, I agree. I had to hold to 19 women and I hated throwing some of them out the door.
I have 69 women in this,
Oh,
a third of whom are women of color. In my book. And for 2020, my goal before COVID kind of threw everything up in the air was to expand it to become 100 for 2020. But then I stopped doing programs and just had
yeah.
But for each woman, I have a coloring sheet. This is Matilda Jocelyn Gage. She's known as the forgotten suffragist. I mentioned her briefly in there. She was a real partner with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and then they had a falling out in 1890 when the two organizations merged back together, and she thought it was too conservative, and she formed her own. But then
I stopped at her house last year.
Out of history, but I actually am her, because obviously in a program on women of color, I'm not one, so I am her for the women of color program, because she ends up becoming an honorary member of the Wolf Clan, of the Mohawk Wolf Clan, which was a matrilineal and woman-powered society that she, I found a wonderful quote, they've been 1,000 years on this continent with women having the rights that women here only started seeking, white women only started seeking with Seneca Falls, etc. So anyway, but yes, so I have many of these women here, but yes, it's just
endlessly fascinating. And Debbie, if you don't have it there at the library, I'm happy to send one down and donate it to the library.
Well, that would be great. I'll get back to you, Nancy. I'm sure I have your email address. You got an email from me?
Yes.
So I'm sure I'll get back to you. I just wanted to mention that if anybody has any sort of commentary that's not political that they want sent to everybody who attended this meeting, and when those who didn't, just write to me and I will put it in there. And Carol, I'm going to include your website because your website is one of the more informative and a user-friendly websites I've seen in a long time. It's really great. And I do again want to thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities through the New Jersey Women Vote, the 19th Amendment at 100 initiative. I want to tell you guys and gals to please like us on Facebook. We have so much information there too, and our website. And if you'd like to be on our newsletter list, just let me know. And I'll send you all of that information too. Is there another question or comment?
I was just going to say that if, for instance, you want to see Overlooked No More this month, if you go to my website, one of the tabs is performances, and it'll have links to, I've got, I think, 20 or so performances this month, so you'll definitely find all my programs available. And just like Union is so welcoming, so are so many of the other libraries. And because we're no longer, we're in virtual space, it doesn't matter that it's 2 hours south of you in the state or whatever. It's the same one click away.
So last call for commentary or questions. Thank you again to all of you who are here and those who are watching later. Thank you to the New Jersey Council on Humanities. And Carol, thank you very much. I know we have a great program when we have you. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It really is a real pleasure. I would like to ask, was there something that surprised you today? Something that you were completely unaware of? That
I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay.
And it stopped.
Anybody want to, anything that they